Hi, and welcome to my channel. The title of this episode is Your Perfect Palette Blues. And in this video, we will be discussing how to choose the perfect blue paint for your watercolor palette. Blue is a staple color in any watercolorist toolkit, and selecting the right shade of blue can greatly impact the overall look and feel of your paintings. We will talk about the different shades of blue available and offer tips on how to choose the right one for your specific needs. So, if you're a watercolor enthusiast looking to expand your color options, this video is for you. So, let's dive right in. So you can see I've got a color wheel graphic that I've made here, and we are going to be talking about this area right around here, from some nice kind of green blues or blue greens, however you want to say it, tomato, on towards some warm blues. Blues that head towards red are generally the ones that I consider to be warmer blues, and the ones that head towards green tend to be what I consider the cooler blues. Now, if we look at this graphic here, you can see, a range of blues in this lower gradient, where we've got, a much cooler looking blue. They tend to look a little bit lighter. So, depending on the pigment, you can certainly make them seem a lot darker too in mass tone, to a much warmer blue that tends to head towards violet. So kind of this range of blues is often what I take into consideration when I'm choosing colors for my palette. I work with a split primary palette. So for my primaries, I am including 2 of each of the primaries. And when designing my palette with that in mind, I'm not interested in having 2 very similar primaries. I want some space around the wheel for each of my primaries. So I have what I consider to be a warm blue and a cool blue, a warm red and a cool red, a warm yellow and a cool yellow. So when I'm picking paints for the palette, I'm looking for something that's going to be on the cooler side and something that's on the warmer side, rather than having 2 that are really close to each other. If you want to work with a more expanded palette with any of the colors, you want to add a third, then you can sometimes pick a color that's very warm, one in the middle, and one that's cool. And with blues in particular, that's something that I have often observed in other artists' palettes. And from time to time, I tend to include a third blue in mine as well. But it all depends on what your needs are. For a basic split primary palette, you really only need a couple. So let's take a look at some different blues and talk about some of the different qualities of blue. So what I have here is a really great resource, and I'll include the link to this below. And this is a CIE Lab color map made by the fine folks at Daniel Smith. And it has awful lot of paint samples. They have an awful lot of paints. I think somewhere around 255 pigments. I stopped counting. But I think most of them are on here. There might be some that aren't. I'm not too sure. They constantly add paints all the time. But we're not interested in all of these. We're primarily interested in these ones down this area here. These are kind of all the blues. And the way this color map is set up, the as you go around the outside, you can see that they move around like our traditional color wheel. We go from blues into violets to magentas into reds, warmer reds. We have our oranges on towards warm yellows to middle yellows, cool yellows, background to greens. And one would think we continue around the wheel. The other interesting piece of information and the way that they've organized these on here is this idea of the chroma or brightness being incorporated. And for me, that's very valuable. I tend to like to use brighter, higher chroma paints because if the paint's bright, it's something that I can then dull down should I need to, either by using a complement or using something like a dark neutral, aka neutral tint or something similar. And neutrals will be a subject of upcoming episode, but I'm not going to get into it too much. But you could use a complement or a dark neutral to tone down a higher chroma or bright pigment. So when I look at a lot of these pigments out here, I'm really mostly interested in these ones along the outside. And we'll kind of go through these and we'll talk about some, and there's a couple on the inside that I'm gonna mention as well. We can start around here. Like if I click there, you can see that we're into, basically blue violet at this point. It looks like purple to me, a little bit. It's towards the violet, but this is something that I'll include for an episode on secondaries. First one that really starts to, pique interest is right here. And we'll start with the warmer blues. Oops, sorry about that. So we have the ultramarine blue and we have the French ultramarine blue. Now I'm just gonna pick one of these, but because as you can see, they both contain the same pigment, PB29. Ultramarine blue is the pigment. One's called French ultramarine, one's called ultramarine. Now, you can see a slight difference on their color map here, where one is a little bit more towards the violet than the other, and it's sort of implied by this color map that the French ultramarine is slightly brighter. Now, personally, I will use either one in my palette. They're very, very close. The main thing is the PB29. It's a very easy to acquire pigment. It's in any kit that you are going to acquire. French ultramarine or ultramarine is usually one of the blue pigments in a kit. It's not a terribly expensive pigment, which is also great. Very light, fast. It's transparent to semi-transparent, depending on the maker. It's medium staining, as is going to be the case with a lot of these blues, and it can be very dark valued, which is very handy, especially for building darker tones paint. So French ultramarine and oops, I don't know why it does that, and ultramarine. Those are two places that we'll start. And going to be, we'll continue around. And again, I'm going to stay on the outside here. Here we have phthalo blue. And phthalo blue, it is listed as pigment blue 15. And there's usually a full colon and then a number. Here you see it's, this pigment blue red shade is usually PB 15 colon 1. And it's of all these synthetic blues, I guess is probably the best way to put it. It does lean red. You're going to see a couple other pigments that I'll bring up here that you'll see the PB15 in them again. And it'll be just a different version of the PB15, a different, recipe, if you will. and it changes the overall hue of the blue, with this being the warmer of them. And then there are cooler versions as well. For example, a phthalo blue green shade. Phthalos are a paint for me I've often struggled with. I know of many artists that use it very successfully. It's only been something that I have been using more as of late. It's also a fairly inexpensive pigment. So, when you're looking at different paint makers and they sell their paints in series or however they want to, break down quality levels or price levels, I guess that's probably the better term. Um, Phthalos tend to be on the lower tier as far as cost goes. It is a high staining pigment with excellent light fastness. And unlike a lot of the blues that we're going to be looking at, the Phthalos are non granulating, which personally is something that I tend to prefer. So, hence why I have been playing with some Phthalos lately. And it is also a very transparent blue, which is quite nice. We'll move over to the next one here. Another staple is cobalt blue. Cobalt blue is beautiful. It's a really, really lovely pigment, PB28. Now, this is a tough one too because the cobalt blue is not a particularly cheap pigment. It does tend to be a little bit more expensive. It does have excellent light fastness. light fastness. And it is a lower staining paint. It's not the lowest staining paint, but it is a fairly low staining paint. So for initial washes and skies and things like that, I find cobalt blues a really nice pigment to work with if you want to do some edge softening, create some nice soft fluffy clouds and things like that. Cobalt blue is pretty forgiving. It's a granulating blue, but it's a very subtle granulation, at least in my experience with the cobalt blue by Daniel Smith that I have used. It may vary from maker to maker. It's always something that you want to kind of be aware of. But it is a reasonable amount of granulation to my tastes. And it is listed as semi-transparent. Now, I mentioned this in another episode, but I do gravitate towards paints that are either transparent or semi-transparent. Don't keep a lot on my palette that would be semi-opaque or opaque. It's just a quality of pigment that I decided that I like, so I tend to go for those. We'll go here to the one, the Verditer Blue, which is a mix. This includes something that I do like to mention because we just looked at the cobalt blue, and sometimes you'll see makers sell something called, insert name of paint and then hue. I tend not to go for the hue ones too often. There have been some historical exceptions for me, but currently there's nothing in my palette that would include hue at the end. When I see hue on a label, so say for example, like a cobalt blue hue, I immediately look at the ingredients. And, in the case of this Verditer blue, when I see this PW4, that's pigment white. So I know it's got some white in there, and that the quality of the blue is going to have a slight milkiness or chalkiness to it, which has been my experience in using this. Now, it is lovely. I'm not trying to speak ill of it. It's just for the way that I like to paint and the qualities that I like. If I want to put some white in it, I'll get some white and add it. I just prefer not to have it in there to start with. So I tend to look out for some things like that. Close that, reset this a little bit. I'm going to go in between. So we have our Phthalo red shade, our cobalt blue, our Verditer blue. And I'm going to go up to this one here, because this is another one that I really quite like. This Prussian blue, PB27, otherwise known as iron blue is what it's technically called. And this version by Daniel Smith has got a really good light fastness rating. And that can vary depending on the maker, from a excellent light fastness to some that the light fastness is a little bit questionable. Though I have been using Prussian blue and at various points for the last number of years, and I have seen no issues with the Prussian blue by Daniel Smith. It is really quite lovely. The thing to note with this one, and you can see it very clearly in the color map here, is it does have a lower chroma. It is listed as a duller or moderately dull blue pigment. It can be very dark valued when you mix it up in mass tone, and it's just a really lovely blue. It's a great blue for painting birds, especially ones that have blues that aren't too bright. It just has a natural dullness to it, which works quite well in my opinion. That's Prussian blue. We'll continue around the outside here, and then we'll kind of load these up and we'll kind of compare them again. So here again is what I was talking about. We have now a phthalo blue green shade. So we have the red shade over here, and now we have the green shade over here. So you can see it's traveled a fair bit around the wheel here. Also listed as PB15. Now, don't confuse this 15 with the one below. The one is off to the end of the series. It's a series one, so it's one of the lower priced series by Daniel Smith. It just lists PB15. I really wish they would include the additional piece of information just to give full confirmation, because I would highly suspect after the 15 would be :3, because pigment blue 15 :3 is the green shade of phthalo blue. And again, it's the same qualities. It's very high staining, it's non-granulating, and it's quite transparent with an excellent light fastness. So it is a very beautiful, beautiful green. When I say I was kind of playing around with the phthalos lately, this is the one that I have been playing around with, and I really like it. It's got a very high chroma. One tube of phthalo blue is probably going to last you a lifetime. That is an exaggeration, but it goes a long way, especially if you're not using it too strong. Phthalo blue green shade. And we'll move up here. Okay, good. Cerulean blue. Now this is a very popular blue in many traditional palettes. It is the color of a spring sky. It's really, really pretty. They have two blues. One is the cerulean blue chromium, and then they also have a cerulean blue. Now, it's the cerulean blue chromium by Daniel Smith is the one that I like. One of the second or third tubes of paint I acquired was cerulean blue by Winsor Newton, and I always thought that was just a really lovely, lovely blue. And when I started using a bunch of Daniel Smith paints, I was like, oh, I'll just get this cerulean blue. And it couldn't have been more different. It was, in fact, not a particular blue that I really liked. I found it very difficult to get a strong value out of. When I did get the value strong enough, the paint just felt a little bit too thick for my tastes. And it was around that time that I started learning a little bit about the different ingredients in the paint, and what's written on the tube isn't always what you need to go by. You need to go by what's written on the tube. I know that sounds funny, but when I say written on the tube, don't just go by the title. You really want to know what the pigment is. And the cerulean blue by Daniel Smith has a different pigment in it than the cerulean blue chromium. The pigment in this is the same pigment as what I had experienced with the Winsor & Newton. So I got a much more satisfying result with this. The cerulean blue chromium is quite lovely. And on the note of different names on labels, blues in particular tend to be one that paint makers, I don't know how to say it other than maybe want to have a lot of fun with. right? So like we talked about the phthalos already, in particular the one I just spoke about, the green shade version of the phthalo blue. And there is a lovely one out there called Antwerp Blue by Winsor & Newton. Well, what's Antwerp Blue? It's PB15, full colon 3. So they've just done something with it where it's just slightly different, but it's the same thing pretty much. Holbein has like Peacock Blue and Process Blue and all these different names for blues. They don't refer to any specific pigment. They're just names. So you really want to look on the tubes. You really want to look on tubes you may already have. Find out what's in it, right? You want to know, just like, what you eat. You should know what it is you're eating, right? When you're painting, you kind of want to know what you're working with. So start learning your pigments, and it can help out a lot too if you're seeing an artist's palette and you're like, oh, I want to try out some of those colors. Well, start reading what's on your tubes, because there's a good chance you might already have it. So cerulean blue chromium is lovely. It is quite granulating. It's a low staining pigment, which is really quite lovely, which again, similar to the cobalt, it makes it a little bit easier to work with. If you want to go back in and soften some edges and things like that, it's a bit more forgiving. That is also in conjunction with the type of paper you're using too. If you're using, cheap student paper, sometimes it's much more difficult to soften edges and things like that. When I say easier to soften edges, I am generally referring to 100% cotton, artist grade paper like Arches, for example. So we'll close the cerulean blue, and I'm going to dip in the wheel again a little bit. We'll go here. So here's another instance of this PB15 popping up again. So here is something called manganese blue hue. Now, again, I saw hue when I first encountered this, and then I immediately looked on the label and was like, is there white in it? And you can see in their ingredients, there is no white in this. What it is good old phthalo blue 15, probably full colon 3. They have done something with it in their lab where it comes out as an overall lighter tint. So you can really get some similar hues to this with a lighter tint of the phthalo blue green shade. Similar, not exactly the same, just similar. So, they're both what I would consider to be cooler blues. But again, here's the title, manganese blue hue, but what's in it? Phthalo blue 15. So do read the labels. Now we're going to pop back out. I'm not going to go into all these ones in here. They tend to be a lot duller, so I don't really go after those too much. I'm going to look at 2 more here, and then we're going to start drawing these in and having a look at them. I'm going to go out here. So here's another phthalo blue turquoise. Now this one is phthalocyanine blue turquoise. Phthalocyanine turquoise. I should have done my vocal exercises before I did this today. Nevertheless, it's PB16. Light fast, transparent to semi-transparent, depending on the maker. It is a medium staining paint. It can be very dark valued in mass tone. And it's slightly dull, but not really. It's very, very pretty. If you're looking for that sort of turquoisey color, and it's a little bit more expensive than the regular, more available phthalo blues, but it is very, very pretty. I'm including this in my conversation about blues, but I'll often include it, to that very blue-green color. But yeah, it is really lovely. And it's non-granulating too, which is something that I appreciate. And then we're going to go to this one right here, because this shows up in a lot of places. And this is the cobalt teal blue. And again, you can see it's a very granulating color. You see all this texture that's in this little swatch here? Lots of granulation as this thing settles out. Right? That's what I'm referring to when I refer to granulation. In the episode on yellows and the one on reds, those aren't really pigments that granulate too much. The blues, it definitely starts showing up. Excellent light fastness. It is a non-staining paint. This is very, very forgiving, this particular pigment. You can lay it down. It's not going to get too strong in mass tone. It is semi-transparent, though I do feel it's slightly opaque. Just somewhere between semi-opaque and semi-transparent seems to be where this feels to me. But it is a great pigment, and you see this in a lot of contemporary watercolorists' work. Often, used in water passages, sometimes just injected into a wash to, insert a little bit of light or some other textural effect to a painting. It's very, very pretty. It's listed as pigment green 50, PG 50. So, but cobalt teal blue is really pretty. So let's add some of these. We'll just pick one of these. Let's go with the French ultramarine. I'm going to click compare. And I'm not going to add the phthalo blue red. Well, let's add it. Somebody else might be interested in this. And we'll add the Prussian. We'll add the cobalt. We will add the phthalo blue green shade. We will add the cerulean blue chromium. We will add the manganese blue hue. We will add the phthalo blue turquoise. And then we will add the cobalt teal blue. Oh, let's see, I've got some more in here, probably from my last video. All right, let's get rid of some of these. Let's see if that got rid of them. And it did. Close. Now we'll add this one. There we go. There's all our blues. Let's enlarge this. Okay, there's all our blues. Going from the coolest blues, if you recall from the graphic earlier, cool blues to warmer blues. Actually, in that graphic, that cool blue looks a lot like manganese blue hue. And then going across as we warm up, heading towards red, all the way towards French ultramarine. So we can look down along the bottom and look at how often granulating, 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 granulating. There's only the phthalo blues, or the ones that include phthalo in it, tend to be the hues that don't granulate so much, with the exception of this manganese blue hue, which they do list as granulating. It granulates a little bit, it's not as prominent as some others, but does have a little bit of granulation. All kind of transparent to semi-transparent. See that along the bottom there. And a very wide variety of staining properties, from low staining to very high staining, especially for the phthalos. Okay. Light fastness on all of these is excellent to very good. So they're all pretty safe. Hopefully you get a little bit more information on the pigments themselves. So let's kind of go through here and talk about, what I would pick. So if you recall from that graphic earlier, where I was talking about wanting to keep a couple, where I'm going to go to something warm and something cool. Okay. So French ultramarine or ultramarine would be, an unquestionable pick. I go through more ultramarine blue than any pigment in my palette almost. Crazy how much you end up using. It goes in a lot of different mixes. I'll use it with an earth orange, like a burnt sienna, or quinacridone burnt orange to, mix grays, do all sorts of things with ultramarine. It's a very, very flexible hue. Phthalo blue red shade is not something I've had a lot of experience with. I just would prefer something like the ultramarine. If you think about the map itself, I get a wider range of blues by staying on this side of the warmth. What I used to, Prussian blue is something I currently have in my palette, just because I do paint a lot of birds. It is a pretty great blue for a lot of that. And I have found that, these samples here aren't totally accurate. It is a little bit cooler feeling to me than this. But it is a very lovely pigment. It works great for a lot of things. Cobalt blue, depending on what you paint, right? If you're not painting a lot of, birds or things that have naturally dull blues in them, there's a lot to be said for keeping something like cobalt blue in your palette. It is, again, it's another versatile color. It's very forgiving, especially when you're getting started out. It is, like, as mentioned, a little bit more expensive, but you can get back in. You can kind of soften up some edges a little bit with it if you make a little mistake. It is friendly that way. Phthalo blue green shade is one that I have been playing with a little bit. So right now, I'm doing a lot of my blue work. I have Prussian blue in my palette. I have ultramarine in my palette, and I have a little bit of the phthalo blue green shade in my palette. And I have been actually quite enjoying having this around. I've gotten more used to its high staining strength. I don't really paint a lot of skies, big skies, very often. So, I haven't had to kind of fight with this in a big wash, trying to make sure that I don't have any edges stain in when trying to expand a big flat wash. So I can't really speak to that. Cobalt blue is really great for doing a really big sky wash. So, I might have to think about that depending on what my subject matter is. But I've been getting a lot of really nice results lately using the phthalo blue green shade. It is very pretty. If you want to use a cerulean, and I'm not saying you shouldn't, I did, and this is the one that I really liked, this particular hue of cerulean blue chromium. It's just really, really lovely. Like I said, it's the color of a spring sky. So if you're doing those types of things, if you're doing some urban sketching or whatnot, it's great for just putting a little passage of blue in your sky. Manganese blue hue. I've played around with it. I like it. It's very pretty. There's some artists that I deeply respect that have this in their palette, and they do beautiful things with it. If I've got phthalo blue green shade around, I don't really feel like I need it, which I'll also speak to the one beside it, which is phthalo blue turquoise. That is something I currently have in my palette too. And somewhere between the phthalo blue turquoise and the phthalo blue green shade and the light tint, I kind of can get this tint. So, I don't really need to keep one more paint in my palette. It is always about trying to whittle down a little if you can. So there you have it. There's a fairly lengthy discourse on blues today. A little bit longer than the other ones, but there ended up being a lot of blues to talk about. Oh, yeah. Oh, no, I did. There's phthalo blue turquoise, manganese blue, and then the cobalt teal blue. Sorry, I was going to talk about that one as well. It doesn't really look this, it seems a little green on here. It is a little bit more blue than that, but you can see in particular here, right in this area, if you look closely, you can see almost a little bit of flocculation in there. That, for me, is kind of why well, it's why I don't use it so much right now. The other thing for me with the Cobalt Teal Blue is I found that when I had it in the palette, I was just sticking it in everything. Now, I mean, there's some painters out there that it's kind of like their trademark color. And it's beautiful, and they make beautiful paintings, and they use this. And I'm not going to argue with it. I think it's fantastic. When I had it in my palette, I just found like, yeah, I was just sticking it in everything. I would just mix up a little batch. I would spatter it into a wash and do all that kinds of things. And, you know, I don't know if I sort of miss it or I was just like, okay, I personally felt like I was just leaning on it a little much. So it was pretty obvious that I was putting it in. So the only thing I could do was to take it away from myself. And that's kind of what I did. So, but it is beautiful. It's a really lovely pigment. So, all right, let's go close this down. Back to our little scatter graph here. And so, yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you all about blue today. So we've talked about yellows in a previous video. We've talked about reds. We've talked about blues. So this kind of closes up the primaries. And I will be making a number of more videos. We're going to talk about some secondaries. I'm not sure whether I'm just going to deal with all the secondaries in one video. I might break it up. And then we're going to be looking at earth hues. And then we're going to be looking at the darker neutral colors. So thank you all very much for tuning in and listening to my thoughts and opinions on picking some blues for your palette. You now know the blues that I'm using. And hopefully somewhere in this conversation, you got a little bit of information on maybe the blues you already have and a little bit of knowledge that might help you kind of figure out what's actually in the blues you're using. Maybe some knowledge that will save you some money. You know, maybe like, oh, hey, I think I need this blue. And then you realize by reading your label and finding out what's actually in your paint that you already have it. But ultimately, it comes down, for me, working with a split primary base, is I want, you know, at minimum 2 blues. And I want those blues to, you know, have some range from each other. So even if you look at it graphically on here, where we have the phthalo blue green shade, the Prussian blue, and the ultramarine blue, you can see just in these points that I have a fair bit of range through my blues. And that is ultimately what I want. I want as much reach around the wheel as I can get, with as strong as a chroma as I can get, with the exception of the Prussian blue. And yeah, it's in a nutshell, that's kind of what I'm after. So that's it for today. Until next time, happy painting, and we'll talk to you again. Bye for now.